Hello, everyone. My name is Maya Krishnan. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Chicago's Committee on International Relations master's program, and I will be pursuing a PhD in sociology at McGill University in the fall. Thank you so much to the organizers and conveners for having me today. I'm really excited to be giving this presentation, albeit virtually. Just before I get started, I wanted to provide a standing trigger warning because my paper does explicitly address gender and sexual violence. Gender violence has consistently pockmarked the mediascape and media history of India, which is ultimately inseparable from the levels of protest and public mobilization that ensue. These cases take the nation by storm. They incite large-scale protests, and they not only make national, but often international news. So I wanted to begin by giving an overview of a couple of very highly publicized and highly mediated cases of gender violence in India. I compiled some snapshot headlines of articles published in the Times of India to present an idea of the kind of language used in gender violence news reportage in this particular publication, which are the materials that my research engages with. So in December 2012, Jyoti Singh Pandey, a recent medical school graduate, was gang raped on a bus while returning from seeing a movie with her male friend. She was in intensive care for almost 2 weeks before she was flown to Singapore for medical treatment, where she subsequently died. The media named her Nirbhaya, meaning fearless one in Hindi. And no, it's not good. I have to start over. Now it works. Okay. Okay, I think it's fine. I think I'll just start over. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Maya Krishnan. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Chicago's Committee on International Relations master's program, and I will be pursuing a PhD in sociology at McGill University in the fall. Thank you so much to the organizers and the conveners for having me today. I'm really excited to be giving this presentation, albeit virtually. Just before I get started, I wanted to provide a standing trigger warning because my paper does explicitly address gender and sexual violence. Gender violence has consistently pockmarked the mediascape and media history of India, which is ultimately inseparable from the levels of protest and public mobilization that ensue. These cases take the nation by storm. They incite large-scale protests and not only make national, but often international news. I wanted to begin by giving an overview of a couple of very highly publicized and highly mediated cases of gender violence in India. I compiled some snapshot headlines of articles published in the Times of India to present an idea of the kind of language used in gender violence news reportage in this particular publication, which are the materials that my research engages with. In December 2012, Jyoti Singh Pandey, a recent medical school graduate, was gang raped on a bus while returning from seeing a movie with her male friend. She was in intensive care for almost 2 weeks before she was flown to Singapore for medical treatment, where she subsequently died. The media named her Nirbhaya, meaning fearless one in Hindi, and then went on to be coined the Nirbhaya case, which is also known as the 2012 Delhi gang rape. The level of protest and publicity that this case incited across the nation was unprecedented and led to several legislative and criminal procedural changes in India, including a new committee for fast-tracking rape cases in the judicial system and new criminal law amendments. Despite these institutional changes, many of the headlines, as you can see here, indicate a diffuse atmosphere of violence, danger, and undoubtedly anxiety. This case was also highly publicized across the world and is continuously hearkened to in any gender violence discourse in or about India. However, despite the level of publicity it was afforded, Pandey's identity as a low-caste woman from a poor family and rural area never made it to the center of reporting and was glossed over not only by the news, but the subsequent protests and mobilizations, including the women's rights movements and discourses that emerged as a result of the publicity. These reported dimensions draw out questions regarding the importance of representing and erasing caste and class, not only in the reportage of gender violence, but also in its incidence and continuation. Building on these questions, more recently in September 2020, a 19-year-old lower caste or Dalit woman, which also means lower caste, was gang raped by 4 upper caste men from the same village as her. This case was also highly publicized across the country and world for both the caste inequality dimensions of the violence, which are impossible to ignore, as well as several other contentious aspects involving the collusion of elite politicians, the police, and the cremation of her body without her family's consent in the middle of the night. If you're interested, I encourage you to read further about this case. Both cases, the 2012 and the 2020 cases, have a lot of similarities, such as occurring near the Indian capital of Delhi. Both victims were around the same age and lower caste and poor women. However, despite the level of protest and mobilization that followed the reportage of both cases, the level of institutional reform that arose from the 2020 case was nowhere near the level garnered in 2012. This is not to say that I'm necessarily interested in comparing and contrasting these two cases. The goal of my research is more so to assess the media and the public through the media's reaction to these cases. Caste dimensions have clearly played a central role in the reportage and publicity of both cases. So what is accounting for the differences in the amount and type of publicity, as well as the different reportage choices across these cases? Just in these two examples, they both gained immense national attention and global traction, but there are several significant differences in reportage and what information is provided and how. I became interested in excavating what has changed and what we can learn by looking at these changes. So firstly, I ask, how is gender violence reported on in English language Indian media, namely the Times of India? The Times of India is India's oldest English newspaper and currently has the 3rd largest readership in the country. Indian news media has a long history of political influence, particularly around inciting large-scale public reactions and movements. Gender violence has historically and cyclically been the source of many of these mass mobilizations far beyond the 2012 and the 2020 cases, and has often provided the groundwork for new waves of women's rights movements in India. I also ask, how have reportage practices changed over time? What do these changes reveal about Indian news ecology, the public sphere, and how the public understands as well as addresses gender violence? How did gender violence become such a widely publicized issue with the potential to drive such wide-scale social movements? Why are some cases more publicized or publicized differently than others? Asking why or how certain cases or narratives receive more publicity than others naturally begs questions around the role of different dimensions of inequality. I focus on the intersection of caste and class inequality in how gender violence is represented in the Times of India. A key point in my research is that gender violence anywhere cannot be understood without equally weighing other dimensions of inequality. The majority of the Indian population lives in poverty and is deeply implicated by the caste system. Although it has morphed and been institutionalized in many different ways, it is still very present and plays a dominant role in inequality across Indian society. By looking at how this newspaper reports caste and class dimensions within gender violence, I ask what these patterns may reveal about the positionality of the newspaper and its readers. Times of India is India's largest English newspaper, and while it is the 3rd largest publication in the country, the top 2 are written in Indian languages. The particularities of Times of India's reporting style, as well as commitments to particular kinds of audiences and publics, is integral to the question of inequality. Finally, by thinking about the larger impacts of reportage practices, I ask how the reportage of these issues is actually constructing the class positionalities of Times of India readers themselves. How do these particular practices of information curation and presentation implicated by caste and class identities actually construct the ideologies of the readers, how they think of themselves, and how they understand what gender violence means in India? What are the consequences of this kind of reportage and narrative making when gender violence incidents rest so critically on the meeting point of caste, class, and gender inequality? For this paper, I used 5 decades of newspaper data from the Times of India, starting from 1970 and ending in 2020. I use both qualitative and quantitative methods in tandem and inductively in this thesis. Many of my qualitative findings informed my quantitative undertakings and vice versa, which allowed me to construct a very robust analytical framework. The quantitative method primarily uses handwritten code to collect every article over the 5 decades that contained the term rape, counting the total number of articles and the total words in all headlines. Through the qualitative analysis, I developed specific words and sets of words, which I then searched through the compiled headlines to generate word frequencies to assess how usage has changed over time. The qualitative methods also involved combing through headlines and articles to search for and construct clusters of incident reporting. I was able to distinguish which cases were highly publicized in a given decade or across decades. I then constructed a timeline of legislative changes and historical events that were significant in capturing the state of public discourse on gender violence. Next, I constructed patterns of changes and consistencies specifically for case identification and labeling. Finally, I conducted a deep textual analysis of all the highly publicized case headlines in order to understand when and where sensational reportage practices were used, as well as what their usage indexed about the newspaper, its audience, and their relationship. The scholarship on Indian news media has clearly established Times of India as a sensational publication, often coining its reportage style as infotainment. As I conducted the textual analysis, I identified sensational reportage when word and phrase choices were making a more equally or affective, I identified sensational reportage when word and phrase choices were making a more or an equally affective or emotional move as an informative one. The first major finding within the quantitative analysis is that the use of the term rape and its associated terms, raped and raping, have unequivocally increased. So we have time on the x-axis here, and the percentage of the words within all the words in a given headline per year is on the y-axis. As you can see, there is an undeniable increase. However, results were divergent for my sensational word frequency analysis. For this analysis, I used a sensationalism dictionary consisting of 5 words: outrage, shame, shock, horror, and anger. It is clear that these terms are consistently present throughout the time frame, but there is no clear trend of increase or decrease like there was for the rape-related terms. Similarly, for caste-related terms, for which I use the words caste and Dalit, which is the term used more contemporarily to mean lower caste, the use of the word Dalit has increased over the time frame, but the use of the word caste has decreased. Taken together, this reveals that these terms are clearly present throughout the time frame, but since there is no trend of increase or decrease, we don't know how they are used or in what contexts. The results for both the sensationalism and caste word frequencies presented an opportunity to turn to qualitative and textual analysis, so I can ascertain exactly how these terms are being employed in context. For my qualitative findings, I first found 3 major consistencies and 3 major changes in how cases were labeled in the Times of India. First, most cases are labeled according to their geography or where the incident occurred. Particularly, cases that occurred in metropolitan or downtown areas are always labeled as such, and specifically such as the neighborhood within a city or a specific area. Cases that occurred in more rural or poorer areas of the city are labeled according to the larger urban center, city, region, or even state. 75% of the cases labeled according to the larger urban center, region, or state have involved a case where a Dalit or a low caste woman was the victim. Second, many cases are labeled with the name of the victim. This reportage pattern is highly interrelated with the geographical pattern. Those cases that occur in downtown or richer neighborhoods, rather than adopt the label of the area that it has occurred in, these cases are often labeled according to the name of the victim. In these cases, her class status is clearly underscored throughout reportage, particularly her education status, and she is always identified as a lawyer, a doctor, engineer, and so on. The map included here demonstrates the interrelation between victim name and geography. There was a case that occurred in 2016 called the Jisha rape case, but it was originally called the Perambur rape case, which is a small village in the state of Kerala. As the case gained traction and national attention, it was then shifted to be labeled the Kochi rape case, which is the capital of Kerala, and then it was called the Kerala rape case. When reportage began to focus on the education status of the victim, namely that she was currently studying to be a lawyer, the case then began to be referred to as the Jisha rape case. This is all still within the context of extant rape shield law, which exists to protect the identity of victims. However, despite rape shield law, this reported style remains very prevalent today. Finally, many cases are labeled according to the name of the perpetrator. These cases are all reported in a very sensational manner, and most of them involve a high visibility perpetrator, such as an actor or a high-level politician. The image included here was from an article reported regarding the Shiny Ahuja case. Shiny Ahuja is a Bollywood actor, and his maid had accused him of rape. The headlines published for this case read very similar to a murder mystery. They were very novelistic and very sensational. Beyond the similarities, there are three major changes, which are firstly, while the word frequency of the word rape has increased, the number of highly publicized cases have also unequivocally increased. So while reportage on gender violence has not only increased, but the number of cases that can be considered widespread and highly publicized have also increased. Secondly, Times of India has expanded from reporting incidents in and around Delhi and northern India to across the country's urban centers. The final major change is that while sensationalism has certainly remained present throughout reportage, how it is used and presented has changed over the time frame. There have been new ways of employing sensationalism, but the underlying theme of sensationally reporting violence has remained consistent. This is a brief snapshot of some of the sensational headlines I used in my textual analysis, just to show the lineage of how sensationalism has changed. Throughout the 70s and 80s, sensationalism is employed in a more traditional sense and more in accordance with my sensationalism dictionary. Terms like outrage and shock are used consistently in reportage, often to present some kind of sweeping reflection on the state of the city, state of the society, and Indian civilization. By the time we get to the 90s and the 2000s, which the Mattu rape murder case spans the entirety of, we can see a shift towards much more novelistic approaches, almost like it would be the title of a movie or a TV show. Things like a modicum of justice, nailing Mattu's killer, who gives a damn about the law, and essentially narrativizing the violence. And then by the time we get to 2020, traditional sensational terms and novelistic headlines are still very much in use, with headlines such as Hathras horror. But reportage has now begun to centralize the reactions of high visibility figures, mostly famous actors and actresses in Bollywood. The nature of what is sensational has changed because it is historically contingent, and it's because it's inseparable from the context that it occurs in. However, despite its historical contingencies and particularities, it has remained the dominant mode of gender violence reportage in the Times of India. From these analyses, I have three major takeaways I'd like to present here. I've tried to convey throughout the presentation that the Times of India consistently signals a very particular kind of reader in its reportage practices, namely one that is educated, urban, and upper class, and this remains clear throughout gender violence reportage across the time frame. Not only does this newspaper cater to this kind of elite reader, but simultaneously, it constructs their ideologies as well. Reportage signals identifiers like high education attainment, crime in well-known and wealthier areas of the city, and celebrity reactions. These practices ultimately communicate something to the readers about themselves, why they should be invested in these stories, and ultimately how they come to understand the reality of gender violence in India. I also argue that the clearly class-implicated reportage practices, especially taken alongside the caste-related ones, reveal how upper class becomes synonymous with upper caste. Caste identity becomes flexible for some victims, such as those who are instead known and publicized for their education status, and subsequently upper caste status is assumed. However, for lower caste women, they are either subsumed by the larger geographic label or they're explicitly identified as such in labels like Dalit women raped. This paradoxical erasure and simultaneous explicit acknowledgement is reminiscent of how scholars like Charu Gupta have argued how lower caste women are simultaneously enveloped and marginalized into the symbol of Hindu womanhood as a Hindu, but not an upper caste. These practices, coupled with the consistent use of sensationalism, detracts from the inherent intersectionality of gender violence in India. While caste may be present in gender violence reportage in more recent years, sensationalism, as the primary reportage practice of gender violence, contributes to an urban, upper-class sensibility that gender violence is somehow exceptional and separate from concurrent systems of power and domination that continue to enable this violence with impunity. Violence is understood as infotainment and as titillating rather than ultimately inseparable from a long history of caste, class, and gender inequality in India. This becomes increasingly important to study in the contemporary political context where Modi's government and the Bharatiya Janata Party utilize discourses centered on upper caste masculinity, which is increasingly dangerous for lower castes and religious minorities in India. So this project has served as an introduction for me to be using news media to understand public discourse around gender violence. I'm grateful to hear any suggestions for future avenues for research or ways to tune up the current project as it is, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have. Thank you so much.